welcome to all of you joining us here today. My name is Audrey Williams. I am a member of the John Mitchell Program for History Justice, John Mitchell Jr. Program for History, Justice, and Race at the Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. And it's really exciting because this is, for the Mitchell Program, the first time we get to say that we are officially part of the Carter School. It was formerly the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, but made the switch just about 2 weeks ago. So we're very excited about that. And we're really excited to have Dr. Tehama Lopez Bunyasi here today. She is assistant professor at the Carter School, and she'll be talking about anti-racism in the United States, and she co-authored Stay Woke, A People's Guide to Making All Black Lives Matter with Dr. Candis Smith at Penn State University. And before I turn it over to Andy Shallal, who is the CEO and founder of Busboys and Poets, who have been fantastic in helping us find a platform for these fantastic discussions. This program is part of A.C.T.O.R, A Continuing Talk on Race, their series. I just want to go over a few ground rules. As you'll be able to see, thankfully now the chat is working. Please continue answering that opening question in the chat. This is a webinar style, so you'll find that your video and your mics are toggled off. That's just so that we can have the most accessible conversation for everyone. But we really encourage you to continue discussing in the chat, and we'll have a discussion moderated by Andy and Dr. Charles Chavis, who is the director of the Mitchell Program, to start off the discussion, but then we'll go over to a Q&A, and we'll be gathering questions, and my colleagues Ajane Roundtree and Christy Jones are gathering questions there. So I think that's it. I'm gonna turn it over to Andy Shallal to tell you a little bit more about this program and about the work at Busboys and Poets and the John Mitchell Jr. Program.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Audrey. And I'd like to welcome everyone, obviously, to this continuing talk on race. This has been really taking off beautifully. I love seeing so many people interested in this conversation. Of course, this conversation is as important as ever. This is, as Audrey mentioned, this is a joint effort with George Mason University, Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, the John Mitchell Jr. Program for History, Justice, and Race, the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project. I want to say a very special thank you, Dr. Charles Chavis, who will be co-hosting this event with me here at Busboys and Poets and ongoing. This series takes off, as was mentioned, where Busboys and Poets had the longest running conversation on race called A.C.T.O.R, A Continuing Talk on Race, provided a venue for intimate and oftentimes difficult conversations around race way before it was cool to talk about race. I know I was involved in many diversity training programs, and the word race hardly ever came up. And I'm glad to see that this is changing. And no one that I can think of can speak about this issue better than our guest today, Tehama Lopez Bunyasi. She is a professor of conflict analysis and resolution and author of Stay Woke, Guide to Make All Black Lives Matter. She has co-hosted with Candis Smith of Penn State University. I had a chance to browse through it and listen to some of the conversations that that Dr. Bunyasi has had. Quite impressed, and really, it's interesting. This book was written about a year ago, and yet it's become the thing now. You know, when you told people about being woke about a year ago, people were like, I don't know what that means, and I don't know, whether I feel it or not. And now it's becoming the thing to do and speak about. So I'd like to welcome you, Dr. Bunyasi, first of all.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. I'm a longtime fan also of Busboys and Poets, because there's spaces you can just walk into and you immediately feel like, oh, there's purpose here. It's not just like great food. The people who are coming are looking for a vibe, and they get it, and they get to have conversations and build relationships.
We like to think of ourselves as the wokest restaurant in town. But I want to bring in Dr. Charles Chavis to say hello as well, and then we'll start with some questions, and then open it up to a conversation with everyone on this call.
Yes, thank you so much. I am so honored to have Dr. Lopez Bunyasi here, a colleague of mine in the Carter School, the newly established Carter School, newly named Carter School. Yeah, we're extremely honored to have her a part of our school, but also to have her as a colleague and so, activist scholar, which I really feel like she's really carrying that mantle and has done a great job with her publication of this book. And I think, as you mentioned, the time is now for social change and social transformation. And this book is just so timely, right? And to have a book, have to be thinking about this, part of the struggle in terms of the long game, Dr. Bunyasi has really been ahead of the curve in a lot of her work and research. And so we're thankful to have her again, and we look forward to tonight's discussion. And Andy, I'll turn it over back to you so we can go ahead and get started.
Well, let's get down to it. I think this is, like we said, an important conversation and very timely. Of course, I don't know when the conversation of race has not been timely, but because race has been an issue, of course, in America ever since its founding and way before that. We have, the first recorded Africans that were brought here in shackles of 1619, and the issue has been ongoing ever since. So this is a very different moment, of course. We're seeing a sea change that's taken shape, at least from how it appears. There are demonstrations everywhere. There are protests everywhere. There are people making demands. Black Lives Matter has become a thing now. It used to be, people would kind of shy away from it. Now, every corporation has Black Lives Matter in its window or on its website. It's become the thing. What's making this moment so different, in your opinion? Why are there so many white people, particularly, involved in this movement at this particular moment in time? Dr. Bunyasi?
That's a great question, and it's a kind of question that's keeping social movement scholars up late because, they're always trying to figure out, well, what's the tipping point, Because this moment, we could have had this moment last year. We could have had this moment 5 years ago, right? This moment has been in the making, and who knows? There really could be something having to do partly with the pandemic, with people having these mounting frustrations, with people see structural inequality, which is a term that is becoming more of a household term now. Apart from like structural racism being apart from racism generally, right? Or at least more defined. When you start to see that people's lives, their life chances are regularly determined by race, when you hold all other things constant, right? And those of us who do like quantitative type of work, when you hold all those other things constant, it's race still predicts, the likelihood that you're going to die young, the likelihood that you're not going to get, this type of mortgage, the likelihood that a police officer is going to put their knee on your neck, right? And so when people are seeing this with a pandemic and they're seeing who is dying disproportionately, people, you can't get away from that. But to give a lot of credit to the people who have been building for decades now on all kinds of conversations like mass incarceration, when you think about people who've been doing their utmost to bring even the idea of prison abolition, right? People who have been holding on to the reparations concept and who've been building. And then every once in a while, these ideas poke through into the mainstream. And sometimes it comes kind of through academics, and sometimes it comes through other activist channels. Maybe a really great journalist gets their hands on it and something happens. And so this moment is built on many other moments. And some people would probably rightly say that this is just the most recent of movements for Black lives, and that we've been seeing these movements since people have been in bondage, right?
You mentioned the academic part of it. I know, I wanted to ask you, what do you feel is the role of academia in this? I know that Dean Ozardem is very committed to this issue, and I know that Charles Chavis is very committed to this issue, make sure that we at George Mason University establish an anti-racist approach to how we deal with this, because oftentimes, it's not just about not being racist, it's about being anti-racist, obviously being more proactive. What do you feel is the role of academia in this movement?
Severalfold. If you want to talk about research, to do the research that most directly impacts the research that's going to ask the best questions, find the best solutions, is going to be most translatable beyond the academy, which was the entire, our whole orientation to this book, was to make it accessible, not to dumb it down, but to make it accessible and make it something that our undergrads could easily read, their parents could probably, you know, get down with. And then if we wanted to go down the street to the high school and, you know, chop it up with the juniors and the seniors, like, we could do that. And so there's that element. The education is the most obvious. What we do in our classrooms it's such a privilege, particularly when you're teaching the semester, and every week for 15 weeks, you get to be with the same people, and you take on another issue, and you build from last week, and the relationships build from one week to another. And in that time, there are a lot of people, there are a lot of things that happen in classrooms that can be, you know, really emotional. Some people get their feelings hurt. Some people can build bridges. It's, you know, it's a real relationship, and you can't think of too many other spaces where people who aren't necessarily kin or friends, who meet with each other repeatedly for a period of time in this intense manner. So that's really important. Our universities, where they're gonna put their resources is gonna tell a big story. Right now, universities have their hands full with what we're gonna do with opening up, and, you know, all the kinds of financial matters that we're dealing with, but to put their money where their mouth is with anti-racism and what that means for recruitment, retention, funding of scholarship, and really just like, really, we have to get it beyond the ivory tower. We have to share. And so that's why I've been really super privileged that that people have wanted to have us on the radio and in forums like this, because this is why we wrote the book, was to talk.
Charles.
Yeah, I wanted to talk specifically about, you know, the current moment. And people may not know, but we're up on the anniversary of 7th anniversary of the founding of the Black Lives Matter movement. And to that end, I wanted to talk about the choice that you make and the decision that you make, a remarkable decision, and something that as a historian we don't see in terms of the larger documentation of the freedom struggle, your choice and to center the Black female experience, specifically in the founding of this specific movement. We know that this is the case in terms of other historical Black freedom struggles, that Black women are at the center, but their stories have been overlooked. But your choice here is a very powerful one, and that is a precedent setting. I wanted to you discuss that a little bit as you made that decision.
Sure. I mean, the movement itself, the people who, you know, pushed us in this direction socially, right? Like, this is started by Black, you know, queer women, and it grew, and you know, it's not just about them, but it grew. And the orientation, the kind of pillars that they set forth about, you know, being not just open, but affirming, to think about, to be affirming of different family structures and what those different family structures need. That intersectionality as a strategic approach to politics is centered in this, right? This is not a decision that Candis and I made. This is how the movement has been constructed. And that, so, you know, when I think about the Combahee River Collective, these women, right, these Black women, many of them queer, right, lesbians, and they are constructing this statement about what it means to be a Black woman, right, and what it means to bump up against various matrices of domination with classism and ableism, right, and to center that, and to say, well, if you're going to make social change, you have to touch on all of these things, or else there's always going to be somebody marginalized, right? There's always going to be unfinished business. And I mean, quite frankly, I mean, all of these movements that we have seen, women have been at the center. They've been doing the work. Patriarchy has been pushing them out of the limelight and out of memory. They were there. They've always been there. They've been carrying the brunt. And so my co-author, I should say, she is a Black woman. I am not a Black woman. We wanted to make sure that we talked about Black women, and we wanted to make sure we talked about, you know, the importance of intersectionality. And so we, you know, we take on that term, and we one thing that we do in the book is in our second chapter, we kind of put, it's like a dictionary of sorts, where we take different concepts and we try to unpack them. And then throughout the book, we put in bold those same words, so you can always go back and reference. And it's a real learning moment. And there are people who've been doing beautiful scholarship on intersectionality, and we, as much as we can, reference them as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
If I could jump in for 1 second, Charles, if you don't mind, I wanted to ask Professor Bunyasi, the idea of your book. You know, in the last chapter, you talk about the 21 affirmations for people to do, and the title, of course, says it's a guide. It's a guide to staying woke. To have a guide, you have to have a willing partner to be able to follow that guide. You have to have people that are already primed to accept it. How do you come to that? I mean, it's one thing to write this guide. It's another thing for people to read it and believe in it and be able to follow it.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you convince the unconvinced? How do you bring the people that are out there or not out there in the street, that they need to be part of this movement and need to be anti-racist and need to be this? Most people, especially white folks, don't want to feel that they're racist at all.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to. They say, "I'm not racist. Don't ask me to do more."
Right.
How do you do that?
Yeah, and I didn't mean to, I think I steered away unknowingly of talking about white people. Let's talk about white folks. I didn't mean to do that. I started going on another rant.
All right.
So there's a lot of ways to answer this, and they're all true. When we wrote this, we were thinking about immediately our students in a class, and that you can have a lot of racial diversity in a classroom. And so what does that particular conversation look like? And then also, what if we were teaching, because she was teaching at Chapel Hill while I was still here, and now she's at Penn State. You know, how could this book also be useful, right, being used in an HBCU classroom? How could this book be useful being at like a super duper white school? And so one of the ways that we do that, first of all, just jump off of the beginning. This is what structural racism is. And we take apart, like, through many institutions, we start with policing and the justice system, and we go with education, geography, healthcare, right? We're trying to connect the dots that we think Black Lives Matter movement has already been doing. We wanted to reorient the conversation of thinking of Black Lives Matter solely as a police brutality or white vigilante against Black people kind of violence, and show a bigger picture and an agenda that also needs to be tended to. So and just in my own work, I have found that the people who have been most skeptical of my work, period, have usually been white folks. And the thing that helps them understand what I'm talking about initially is numbers. So when I throw a book of statistics at them of all different sources that are not in cahoots with one another and saying we're finding the same thing over and over again, that's a fact, right? And I know we're in this weird ass, like, what is a fact type of world right now, where, you know, up is down, whatever, but these are facts, and they've been facts. And so we present those facts up front. Another thing that we do in our fourth chapter, we ask, are you upholding white supremacy, right? And one of the ways we do is by tackling colorblindness and respectability politics. And how can these things, these seemingly innocuous type of things, these things that have been seen as a good, have been holding back the kind of progress that we're looking for? And we also, so we kind of unpack that, like, these are things we do. We already know the scripts. We follow these scripts all the time, but how do we interrupt these scripts? Another thing that we do is really just be like, listen, everyone is fallible and you're gonna screw up. So let's just take that as fact also. Let's snarkiness is not going to build a movement, right? Everyone, we can come to like with a different amount of patience to type of our work with one another. And, you know, maybe you have very short patience for people who are not quite there. Maybe your role is to do something else and not work with the neophyte, right? But for those people who have the patience and energy for the neophyte, let meet people where they're at, right? Beware of woker than thou itis, which is something we put in chapter 6. Like this is not helpful, and actually might be like a really vain thing to be doing. So when it comes particularly to white people, there are I mean, we know, and as my own research in other ways shows, you know, the color blindness is the main racial ideology that whites gravitate towards. So how do you pull it apart, right? You have to get away from individualism and start showing these life chances are really important, right? And then you need to challenge the way that people talk about racial inequality, which by default, people keep going to the discrimination against people of color rather than about advantages towards white people. So you have to dispel rightly the idea that there's some kind of neutral ground here. There is no neutral ground. We are not the first people to say that. You can hear plenty of people in the 60s saying the same thing, right? And prior to. So when you start to shift the conversation about racial discrimination in favor of, and you're able to incorporate history, talk about what affirmative action looked like with the New Deal, with the GI Bill, right? Talk about another vision of a world that we could have built on with the Reconstruction period. And people start to, you know, possibly open up to other possibilities, and not just make it about themselves, that they're actually part of something much bigger, but they get to play a role in it, you know? So that's one of the ways that we try to really speak to white people in this book.
Thank you. Charles.
Yeah, I'm going to actually turn it over to the audience. We have a couple of questions coming in. Ajane or Christy, I think we have, excuse me, Ajane or Audrey, we have a question from Raul. Would you like to read that for everyone?
Yeah, I can go ahead and read it. This is Audrey. So we've had a question from Raul, and it reads, can terms like anti-racist, white privilege, white supremacy culture put us at risk of losing our much needed audience? Is it selling out to tone it down and use terms like unconscious bias, dominant culture, and racial narratives instead? And the second part of that question is, how do we find that balance to keep our audience listening?
Okay, so all of those words actually mean something different. So we can't just swap them out for one another. But to get to the gist, I think, of the question is, so what about the people who aren't in the choir? What about the people who we want to bring out, you know, bring into where the choir, I'm not going to say the church, right? But do you bring them in, right? This is a hard fight. This is a hard thing to do because I think one of the most important things is to try not to like attack people. You know, generally speaking, when you want to build, you know, alliances and bring people into movements, you don't want to necessarily attack them. Present them with information, present them with facts. I think one of the things that we do in chapter 2 with these definitions is, first of all, say there are all kinds of people who are using the same words differently. And so when we start conversations, it's really helpful to say, well, what do you mean when you say such and such? Or when I'm talking about racism, this is how I see it, right? Because some people, when they're talking about racism now, they're straight up talking about structural racism, and they're not even talking about bigotry. They're not talking about epithets. They're not talking about those things. And yet those things could all be called racism. It's just, what terms are you using? If the question is about how are we going to get people who are on the fence, that's a tall order. Because how long can you sit on the fence and watch all of the things that have been happening, right? Like those people on the fence have to have a moment of courage. And I think what gets them off the fence, and we're talking about white folks here, when white people see other white people taking action, when white people see other white people talking about advantages, that they get unduly, right? That they're getting, it takes the burden off of trying to, you know, think, do I have a place in this? How do I say anything? You know, can I, you know, I'm afraid I'm going to screw up saying something. And it normalizes the idea of race consciousness, because what is normal for white people is color blindness, and it is super powerful. It's so powerful that it's in ways that might not seem like a big deal, but like, imagine a scene at a bar, right? Like when we used to go to bars, and somebody, you know, says a stupid and racist joke, and then everyone else is quiet about it except for one person. And most of the people who are here in the audience today have often been that one person. And thank you for being that one person. But being that one person really sucks a lot, right? But you're being courageous. You're saying, listen, that's not funny. I don't appreciate that, right? But when you do that, everyone else is kind of like tuning in and being like, oh yeah, you know, that was awful. That's not a thing you should be saying, right? And there's better ways of being. And you start to set an example, right? But for the person who speaks up, there could be a real moment of loneliness. And I have another book that I'm writing and I'm almost done with, and it's about white people who take on this work, right? And it can be a lonely road for them, and it can break up lots of relationships. It can estrange people from their families and the people they grew up with, especially. And yet they are finding the courage to do it because they find, first of all, that there's a better life for them as a white person than to give into this color blindness and to just really, quite frankly, be sold short of the full breadth of their humanity and the way their interactions could be. So they take these risks and they learn how, and in time, how to do it better with other white people rather than trying to make them feel like crap, right? Like sometimes it'd be coming home at Thanksgiving and it's just like, I'm gonna make everyone feel like shit because I feel guilty and I want you to feel guilty. After a while, they learned that didn't work so well, right? But how do I get down and talk to my uncle who is pissed off about affirmative action because he thinks that his kids aren't gonna get a fair shake, right? I don't think we should be watering down. I think we need to be precise. I think we need to say, you know, racial privilege or white privilege, we should use it well. Like, I find that it's best used when we are comparing similarly situated people. That's how it makes most sense, right? So like if you're talking about people who are, if we're talking about healthcare, for example, and you want to talk about people who are getting, you know, properly diagnosed with breast cancer, you want to compare similarly situated people. How are white women at 55 with health insurance being treated or diagnosed versus Black women who have breast cancer being diagnosed, Latinas, right? And you do the comparison and you hold constant that the fact that all these women have health insurance, right? You hold constant the idea that they have similar income. And when it's still race that's predicting who's going to get the best, most aggressive treatment, who's going, you know, whose doctors are going to fight for them, that's white privilege, right? It's the racial boost, right? That's one of the ways we could talk about it. Be precise, right? We have so many words available to us. Let's use all of them. This makes me also think about really the strategy for the Democratic Party. There have been a lot of people who have said, well, we need to get the poor white people on board. You know, if we show them that they have something, you know, something to gain by voting for Democrats, like we can do better. The thing is, right, if you constantly frame it in like terms of we want to get the poor white people and make them the priority, you are once again privileging white people, right? Like instead of that poor people in general could be benefiting from the following things, you make it about white people. Now we're back to square one again, right? And I just think that there's a better way of doing things. Thank you for the question. I think it's super important.
Thank you. I did have a question as well to kind of like extend and piggyback on. Specifically, this speaks to one of our attendees' question as relates to corporations. But we're noticing in this moment, corporations, NFL teams, who are trying to get behind the movement, right?
Yeah.
And we know what reasons are. There's several reasons that we can consider that are causing them to do this. But I really wanted to get your thoughts on the specific shift that we're seeing in terms of businesses and corporations attempting to join these efforts. And this speaks to a larger issue that was brought up in the previous panel with Peniel Joseph, specifically as it regards to the balance between symbols and structural change.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. So, those of us in the DMV region are thinking a lot about this Washington team right now. And I welcome the change. Again, another thing should have happened a long time ago. And I think we're seeing that the reason this change is happening is because of money. And so for certain either people or entities, it is going to come down to the almighty dollar of what you're going, what are your motives and where are you going to put your money? Given that we live in this capitalist country, right now this isn't going to change. We're not going to start becoming uncapitalist all of a sudden. I think we may start, nurturing our socialist roots a little bit more, right? Those things could become stronger because those things aren't recent. These are like 100 years old. But you know what? Corporations should pay. They should be doing something because they've certainly been reaping benefit right and left from all kinds of communities. The best models of businesses are those that, pay their people properly. The best models for those are, for corporations, generous shareholders, you're aggressively recruiting people of color and people who've been marginalized into your business. For food-oriented businesses, it's, trying to get the best products and pay the people who are the farm workers and the factory workers, pay them the best and do that work. And so when you see a Ben and Jerry's make a really dope statement a month ago, it actually resonates much better because they wrote one 3 years ago, right? So some businesses have already been doing the work. And I'm not saying like, I don't know Ben and Jerry's back and forward, but I know that they have advanced business in a way that to normalize the idea that like chocolate from certain places should be well sourced, that these people over here should be paid well, and that, we don't want hormones over here. Like that matters. And I think that people are being caught on the back foot trying to respond and, put their, anti-racist thing out there, and because they're not prepared, they don't know how to be anti-racist because they've never quite frankly really thought about it before. I think they've really tried to avoid being sued. So like they're like, okay, another human resource thing, right? And I think corporations have a place to play. I welcome corporations to try to figure something out to make themselves better, because they are, for better or worse, part of the U.S. system. And so much of the unfinished work of the civil rights movement has been economic. And businesses have a huge role to play in that. And, even, not even just like major corporations, but like what businesses do with like, taking advantage of enterprise zones or whatever it is, there's a role to play. So there's probably a lot more nuanced things to say about that, but there's a role to play. And especially when you have, corporations where like the employees are asking for it, they're asking for, a step up, they're asking for conversation, and then the head honchos honor that. That's something. I don't want to, play that down. I think that there's something to that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Andy, did you have anything, or would you like for me to go to the audience?
Uh, let's have the audience, some more questions from them. I think there's a lot of questions. This is a very interesting topic, and I think there's so many unanswered questions. And even like we've had many people on this in this conversations over the past few weeks, and there's a lot of nuance, that we're learning as we move forward, and people are trying to catch up, and sometimes it feels like it's overwhelming for a lot of folks.
Yeah.
And I think it becomes, where do you stop? Where does it end? Like people want to know, like, is this going to ever end? Like
it never ends.
Absolutely, and that's the key, right? But I think as far as what Charles was asking with the changing of names and the symbols and all of this, you can go on. And I mean, the university you're in, George Mason, was a slaver. You have George Washington, the founding fathers. Almost all the founding fathers were slavers. And
the UVA. That's my diploma from UVA, Thomas Jefferson University.
Thomas Jefferson, exactly. So you have, so it goes on and on and on. I mean, I live in the District of Columbia, and it's named after Columbus, and it's also Washington. So we have a double whammy here. And I want to thank you, particularly Dr. Bunyasi, for speaking up for statehood, by the way. I think that's really great.
Oh my gosh, I am trying to hashtag the heck out of that right now. Just thank you. Oh my gosh.
Much appreciated. But so we're for an average person that's just trying to wrap their head around this movement and where's it going to go and so on, there's a fear that starts to develop, right? Especially for people that have been used to privilege and been, in that space. And suddenly, every day, another domino falls, and they just don't know where it's going to end and where they're going to be at that end moment. How do you deal with that? How do you bring them in?
So a lot of white people aren't constantly conscious of the advantages, of the privileges, until they are like named, highlighted, or at risk of being lost.
Well, and it's exhausting, right?
Yeah. And so, and at the same time, I think there's like this really great debate between these, brilliant thinkers, Derek Bell and Charles Mills, who think differently about how white people understand or don't understand racism. And Charles Mills is more of the mind that white people are so ideologically deep into it that they can't like fish in water, right? It's kind of like, I can't see this. Derek Bell, on the other hand, is like, no, they know. They know, and they are holding on. And so, and in a way, like, there's truth to both, right? And so if the fear, some white people fear that like white people are on top of this hierarchy, then what the social change that's coming is just going to flip it upside down. That's like the ultimate fear, is that they're going to be the bottom. I don't know a single person of color who's like, that's my aim, is to put white people at the bottom. The aim is to get rid of the hierarchy, right? And so you have to ask yourself, what matters more to me? Comfort or equality? What matters more to me? Comfort or democracy? If I am proud to be an American, what does that mean if not this, right? And so that there is another world to live in besides this one. That there are, that the security of racial privilege is not a security at all. Being bonded in an alliance, in deep relationship with people of color, is more of a secure feeling for any of us, right? The idea of like being bonded to one another in a relationship that we love is the security we should be seeking, not domination over one another. That's not safety. You're always going to be in a precarious position if you're the one who's pushing someone down all the time. That's not safety. And the thing is, most people don't know that this is what they're doing, right? And because most of them, or what they're doing, is just kind of complying, right? Or they're so fearful to speak up, or they don't know how. They're not trying to comply, but they really don't know what to do. We live in such a racially segregated society that most white people don't even have friends of color. So if they're gonna like break ranks with other white people, they're gonna be loner, and they're afraid of that. And I understand that would be a lonely place to be. So I'm totally forgetting what your original question was right now. But
no, because there are so many things. Where do we stop at the changes? Where do we stop at the that shift?
thank you.
Things and stuff. Yep.
When we can no longer predict life chances by race, then I think we can take a rest.
Well said.
But
Audrey.
that's not going to happen in our lifetime, so we just have to keep pushing.
Thank you so much, Audrey.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Lopez Bunyasi. I'm actually going to bring on Christy Jones, who's one of our team members and a PhD candidate at the Carter School, to ask a question.
Hi, Dr. Lopez Bunyasi.
Hi.
As you know, how are you? As you know, I've used your book, Stay Woke, twice in my classes. I love it, and it's such a phenomenal tool, I find, working with students who are looking at the particular classes I did was culture, identity, and conflict, and it was just a great resource in the class. I actually wanted to ask a question that I had heard in one of my classes that I had always wanted to ask you. Mm-hmm. So I had heard particularly from African diasporic communities, including the Latinx community, I've heard some people say that Black Lives Matter is a Black American thing. And how would you respond to this idea? From your perspective and from your vantage point of the book, is Black Lives Matter focused solely on those Americans who are descendants of the American enslaved, or is it and should it be much broader?
I think it's broader in a lot of ways. So it's okay. If you are ascribed as a Black person, right? If the world treats you as a Black person, sees you as a Black person, then Black Lives Matter is concerned about how you're treated, right? And so whether you are the descendants of people who were enslaved here in this country, or whether you came to the United States recently, and from Ghana, or you're from Ethiopia, or wherever, and if you are treated as a Black person, yeah, they're concerned about your life and your livelihood. And I mean, we can think of people who have been, cut down. In this, Amadou Diallo comes to mind immediately, right? I was in college when he was killed, right? That was a long time ago. And but it's because of murders like his, because of police brutality against people who are African and African American, that this movement has been built. The bigger question of what is the purpose of the political direction right now in this country with this movement? Well, there's Black Lives Matter, which seems to be, as a very loosely networked kind of group, more focused on the efforts of the local, or people, local people saying, we know what we need, and so we're going to organize around that, right? And the movement for Black Lives being more of an effort to orchestrate between different areas and different groups, and even internationally, so that, we saw people protesting in London. We see people rising up in France, right? We see solidarity in Syria, right? People who are facing absolute horrific conditions, and, that's a whole nother subject, who are expressing their solidarity here, right? So that this is, that we see people in Brazil who are understanding this because they have their own experiences. I think that this is a much bigger issue, and it's encouraging to me, and it feels like a little bit of history repeating itself when I think about the efforts of Malcolm X, right? And the efforts to coordinate between countries, right? And bring issues to the United Nations of saying how African people in the diaspora have been treated. So I think this is this is worldwide, I think it's really important. And as we put in chapter 5, which is really about trying to make federalism sexy, is to like focus on what can you do locally, and why the local matters so much, right? And so so one of the things that we try to do in this book is to push back against the critiques of Black Lives Matter, which have often been, this looks uncoordinated, there's no leaders, like, you know, where's your Martin Luther King person, right? And, you know, I love Martin Luther King Jr. He was one person, and he was not the full story of the civil rights movement. So when you have all of these really brilliant people acting in their communities, we're seeing the work, and that is the work, that work matters. It's literally changing what's happening from Mississippi to Minnesota. It's happening, right? Because of local people. And it's beautiful to see brown people stepping up, and not only in solidarity with Black people, but also putting some attention on what's happening in brown communities with police brutality as well, right? And especially the kinds of the life that's being lost in this pandemic, right? That we are intertwined with one another. So yeah, I think this is way bigger. But if it was only about Black people in the United States, it would be worth all of this attention and then some, right? So when Black Lives Matter says that it is an unapologetically Black organization, what I understand that to mean is that they're going to focus on Black people, and they're not going to make excuses for why to divert attention elsewhere. Because if you focus on Black people and their livelihoods, and those get better, then they raise all boats. So in doing that, you create better relationships, you have more egalitarianism. And so that is why there should be no apologies for the focus on Black people.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Any more questions, Audrey?
Yeah, so we have a few more, and I might try doing something where I kind of pull a few together, if that sounds like it works.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I want to kind of loop back a little bit, Andy, to what you were talking about a little bit as well, in terms of kind of confronting legacy at universities of, you know, this is still, you know, this is our history in terms of, you know, George Mason University is named after someone who enslaved people, right? But also just broadly speaking, like, you know, going back to kind of more the systems. We've had some conversation, for example, in the chat by some questions brought up by a Mason grad, actually, about just, you know, certain places where Mason funding comes from, in terms of, you know, universities are broad campuses, right? There are a lot of different schools and centers on the campus, and the whole point of a university too is to kind of have that broadness of ideas, right? But what that also means is what we're experiencing now in this current moment, not just George Mason, but institutions and universities all across the country are these, you know, different tension points around, you know, how do you act cohesively as a school to confront white supremacy when also, you know, people are at different points, and there are different, you know, systemic issues. You can't, I'm kind of creating a question out of a really important discussion that I've been seeing in the chat. I'm sure you have too, and I want to thank Tegi for it. And I apologize if I'm not pronouncing your name right, Tegi. And then, you know, another question that also kind of has, I hope you don't mind, Dr. Lopez Bunyasi, I'm asking you the hard questions right now. Our audience members are asking you the hard questions, but I think it's important. Courtney White has asked a question, and I'm going to read out her question. She says, as indicated before, the application of numbers is crucial in combating racism's existence. When looking back at many race-based acts of mass violence, for example, are we to assume that these acts bring substantial evidence to prove the Black community is or has become victims of genocide on America's soil? If not, what evidence might be lacking to substantiate the claim? Again, it's a really tough question, but I think, again, our audience members are asking the really important and tough question. So
Okay.
I'll hand it over to you.
Okay. Universities. So above all, the university should be a place for critical thinking. It should be a place to learn a whole bunch of new ideas, to challenge ideas, to have to defend your ideas. And I love that about universities. I love that about a classroom. And what some people think is, what some people feel like their civil liberties or their freedom of speech is being squelched, is, I'm not interested in squelching anybody's freedom of speech so long as you are not insulting or dehumanizing another person in the classroom, right? And once you start doing that, that now interferes with the learning process. I think it's what's hard is that universities are not giving us guidelines. And I don't think they're going to give us guidelines about what we should say in our classrooms, what we should read in our classrooms, what words do or do not get, written down or whatever. Because a lot of things do come down to the words that we use, which is why words are so powerful. I think that we should be exchanging ideas. I think that when you start insulting people, that's just not okay. So we have our share of controversy here at our own university, and every university I've ever been affiliated with has its share, because they're old and they were mainly the kinds of institutions that were created for mostly white men and white elite men at that, until, you start seeing people trying to dodge the draft and, right? Like, I mean, the way you see universities grow is because they're trying not to fight a war, right? Like really interesting, like that's important. It's important for the kind of ideas that started to come in. And, what did it mean for white women to start coming to colleges en masse, right? Meanwhile, right, like that's not even saying anything about the kind of education that's been happening at HBCUs. So these are all, universities have their work cut out, but they also have some of the smartest people working there, right? And they also have not just the smartest people working there, but you have these absolutely awesome, mostly young people who are smarter than we were. And they still have to learn how to talk to one another, and they have to also learn not to be woker than thou-itis, that kind of thing. But they are so sharp. So I'm very hopeful that we can do better than we did last year, and then the year after that we're going to be even better. A lot of this comes down to funding. You have to support faculty, you have to support programs. When you are a university that cuts an African American Studies program because of a pandemic, you're not doing your part. You're actually making things far worse, right? And I can name that institution right now, but you can also just Google it. So that's one thing that I'm happy, that this university is doing, is because of the work of a Black woman faculty member, Wendy Manuel Scott, who has worked so hard on not only on kind of uncovering the legacy of slavery that was in the George Mason, estate, or that his enslavement of other people, right? But to make that a learning moment for our students, for them to learn, research methodologies and the process of uncovering that work. And then here we have the construction of, I think we're calling it a memorial, or it's some kind of whatever we're calling it, but to recognize the human beings that were enslaved by George Mason within the same walking distance of the statue of George Mason himself. It is created in order to put them in conversation with one another. And so, right, my hat is off to Dr. Wendy Manuel Scott. My hat is also off to the administration, and not just the current one, because it's brand new, and he seems, our new president seems to be on it, and I love it. But our previous president, who was ushering this, right? Who's saying, yes, we need to have this. It needs to be in the center of campus, not off on the side, off, you know, behind the parking lot, in the middle. And we're going to talk about it. And I love that because it changes space, and it's not just symbolic. It's about learning. It's about values, and it's about things that we're not afraid of. The second question, you'll need to paraphrase for me again. Please.
Yeah. No, it was no worries. The second question, and I'm pulling it up, was basically Courtney White was asking, kind of looking back at kind of the sheer numbers of violence against the Black community, of mass violence. Basically, could that be evidence that the Black community has been or have become, you know, victims of genocide on the soil of the United States?
Yes, in all kinds of ways. So the Middle Passage is a passage of genocide. Prior to the Middle Passage, right, the shackling, the transporting people, the incarcerating people on the shores of Africa is a genocidal process. There is an amazing interactive tool. I wish I had it right now in my head, but it shows every documented voyage of a ship that was transporting people from Africa enslaved to the Western Hemisphere. It shows the name of the ship, how many people were aboard when it started, and then how many people got off, right? And they do it in 2 or 2.5 minutes. And you can pause it, and you can look at all the details. And that's one of the best resources I've seen to try to directly comprehend the loss of life. And so I encourage you to try to find, I think it was on slate.com. I think that's where it was hosted. In chattel slavery, in this country and other parts of the Western Hemisphere, is a genocidal process. I mean, to just, obviously in the physical sense, but also in the cultural sense, right? The loss of languages, or the attempt to try to, you know, take people's language away and to try to take their relationship, their own unique relationship to God away. That's another genocide process. Then, I mean, you just kind of go from one scene to the next, right? Like, in the redemption area, which is what white supremacists call it after Reconstruction, right? The killing, the lynching of Black people in mass all over this country. And now we see, right, mass incarceration, which is really another form of genocide. There are people who are being lost early. They are being taken away from communities. They are experiencing civil deaths. And my colleague, Patricia Malden, is starting to think really deeply about what that means. These are all different types of genocides, and they're happening right here on this soil, and they've been happening. And so, I mean, that's such a huge toll. There are people who have been documenting it. We could add it all up. What it does amount to is various forms of genocide, absolutely, alongside and in conjunction with those who are indigenous people here.
I think it's also important to note, you know, Michelle Alexander in her book, The New Jim Crow, there are more people, more Black people today behind bars than there were enslaved in 1850.
It's nuts.
That's hard to wrap your head around, right?
Yeah, because when you can't see those people.
Yeah, then they were enslaved in 1850. So that's pretty shocking information and facts that people can use as well. And speaking of these issues that you brought up, and Audrey, I think, asked some of these questions, the issue of reparations has to be at the center of this conversation, because once you do wrong, there's a way to fix it. I mean, we have systems. You know, if somebody hurts somebody or steals something from somebody, there's a reparation that comes through. The legal system provides that. First of all, what is your thoughts about reparations, and why do you think it is something that has been off the table for so long? It seems like, you know, from a legal perspective, it'd be a natural thing, and there's precedence for it. We did
Right.
it for the Japanese. You know, reparations were given to slaveholders when slavery ended, in many instances, because they wanted to repair what they lost. And so why are we having such a hard time with this?
Well, I have to give credit to people who have been constantly trying to, you know, call for it. There's been a constant stream of calling for it. That it has enjoyed various levels of public support has come and gone, and that's very much about political will. And because you're right, we have the precedent, we have documentation. So it depends on, like, reparation can mean many things. In the most, like, individually direct recompense type of sense, if we wanted to do it that way, we could do it. We have records from the Freedmen Bureau of the banking, right, that happened. Like, you have individuals, you have churches and, like, communities whose names and addresses and all their finance was all tangled up. It's documented. It's in the Library of Congress right now. We could go do it. And so when there was an economic crisis at the end of the what brought kind of the end of the Reconstruction period, because white members of Congress, first of all, they're you know, up against financial crises, but they lost the political will to back Reconstruction, right? And there's this immense corruption in the way that it was administered, and so these people got screwed. Like, there was all kind of illegal things that happened, but their names are right there. We could, if we wanted to, we could, you know, tally up the money, we could compound the interest, and we could send descendants money. If you want to take an approach like Ira Katznelson suggested, and When Affirmative Action Was White, that's his book, his idea is that you have this massive piece of legislation, somewhat akin to the GI Bill, but for everybody. And his idea is that you fund public things so well, right? You fund the heck out of public schools, and you make mortgages possible for everybody, and you know, if it's canceling debts that are, you know, outrageous, whatever it is, you do it so massively that there's like a serious shifting of the lay of the land. And his idea is then you don't do it again. Now, okay, I mean, that's a great theory of, like, a massive thing that we could do. We've done something before like that. I don't know if one would be enough, but I mean, maybe if you just, you know, some people are like, oh, that's socialism, you know, right? But, like, if it's about putting some people on like material even ground, then you can change a lot, right? But so there's this toss up between whether you do things individually, whether you do things as a country, whether there is a real tension right now. I see it on social media between, right, the idea that, is it going to be all Black people? Is it going to be people who are descendants of those who were enslaved here in this country? Like, what about Black immigrants? Like, there's a lot of infighting about even just that possibility. I think what's really important, and we say this in the book, is that the fact that people are talking about it at all, right? There are these beautiful theorists who have said, this is a democratic exercise in and of itself, which is a good, because we are opening up the possibilities of doing something radical. And it's something radical that would have to be done. But in the end, this all comes down to political will. If you don't have the will, it won't happen. We could do it.
Charles or Audrey, if you have any other questions.
Yeah, so we have a few more questions. I'm gonna do another combined one, but I'll try to be better about being clear. And you can always let me know, remind me. So we have a question from Manga da Silva, and he asks, what would you say about the capitalist system and the idea of race as a construct to perpetuate capitalism? And he says, for instance, the justice system is structured to disadvantage the minority at the expense of the rich prison owners. So what is your opinion on economic systems and race? And that kind of goes to what you were just talking about. So kind of building upon that. And then we have another question from Georgia Hanforth. And she asks, what would you say are the roles of different types of spaces? So for example, like mixed race spaces, very public spaces like protests, more intimate spaces like a classroom, you know, different activist groups such as race-specific activist groups or mixed race activist groups, and then all the way down to kind of, right, that very intimate like interpersonal relationships and families. So what are the roles of these different types of spaces to build understanding, relationships, and power to take on structural forces?
Okay, the capitalism question. I mean, I don't understand capitalism outside of racism. I don't understand racism outside of capitalism. They are, they made one another, and they made it here. So, so what then does that mean is that we've never had a capitalist system that wasn't racist. We've never had racism that wasn't capitalist. And so so what does that mean for undoing it? If capitalism, there's always going to be a hierarchy with capitalism. So the question is, how much of that do you want? Right? Like we are so comfortable in a way, because we know it. We know what it looks like. We think we understand the rules of the game, except not everyone can play and have, you know, it's not like you get to just like choose your player and, you know, like you were born in a certain way in a certain place and your cards were dealt to you. And so in the book, right, we talk about the idea that there's a lot of social closure. There's not a lot of like, the idea of upward mobility in our country is more of a myth than fact. It happens. But what more likely happens is that people stay right where they were born, or they go down in economic mobility. So if what you want to do is undo hierarchies, then you have to undo them all. And I think we're seeing a lot of fear about that, because the whole like racist backlash against the most progressive people in the Democratic Party right now, those backlashes come with other terms, and those terms around socialism, right? Commie, reds, pinkies. It's the same thing that was like, you know, 50, 60 years ago. And so when we think about even our past, we have seen anti-racist, socialist efforts, or people who were imagining a different way of relating to one another. And maybe that's the most simplest terms that I can put out, is what are the different ways that we can differently relate to one another? Because that's, you know, racism is all about relationships, and whether they're like, you know, individual to individual or group to group or institution to institution, these things are all how they relate. So is sexism, right? I mean, but so is capitalism, so is social, you know, classism. So we have to do a lot of like big thinking here about what are we going to live with? What are we going to say, I'm okay with this? If you are okay with the idea that there is a disproportionate amount of if there's a proportionate amount of Black people who are in poverty as there are white people, if that's where your comfort ends, then one day maybe we'll succeed, right? But for some other people, that's not going to be okay. It's not going to be okay that there's anybody living in poverty, let alone children. And that's one thing we put in the book, is that when you use children as the barometer for things, all these things about meritocracy, all that stuff goes out the window, because they don't get a say. Their agency hasn't formed yet in the way that an adult has. So the fact that there are all kinds of children living in poverty, if we're comfortable with that, then that's on us. That if you're gonna be, hey, I'm gonna stop there, then that's where you're gonna stop. I don't know what that says about you. I mean, maybe it means you're tired, but maybe it means that like you're okay with some immorality. I think we can do better. There's just so much wealth in this country. There's so much surplus in this country. Like, why should anybody go hungry? It's absurd. it's absurd to me. I see, you know, the United Farm Workers, they post these videos of people working in fields on a daily basis. And the way these people are working, like pulling radishes like this out of the ground, right? They're using sharp tools constantly, like right by their hand. Just, it's like, they're like machines. They're being taught, like, that's the way that they make their livelihood is this, it's so dehumanizing. Like, we can do better. We have enough. So I don't even, I think if you're really about equality, like, we have to push for that. And it's not okay that rich people become infinitely more rich, like, because of loopholes and what everyone else is like scratching to survive. Like, that's not okay. And that's part of racism, is that it fuels that. In capitalism, there's these myths of that people, you know, they earned it all. That's why they have what they have. And it's like, and if you don't have anything, then you were just whack. Like, somehow you didn't try. And that's not true. So we can do better. I forget what the other question was now. I keep doing that.
No problem. So the other question was from Georgia Hanforth.
Oh, but different faces and different compositions.
Yep, there you go.
Yeah, like, so I mean, we all have different, you know, categories in our lives. Of course, they've been much more limited in quarantine, haven't they? Yeah, a lot more so. But we're still talking to people, and you know, people have heard the term code switch. And there's a lot of ways to think about code switching. So it's not just like the way you speak, the way you sound, but like, what are the types of, you know, what are the ways in which you're engaging, right? So I think it's okay to code switch a bit to your audience, but keep your principles, you know, at the center, and keep them, you know, that's your purpose, right? And that there's just some people who you're going to talk to that, like, things are so shorthand, you don't have to explain anything. I have my friends or different colleagues that I can just give a look to, and they know exactly what I'm thinking, right? Like, you have those relationships. And then you have other people who you haven't talked to in a minute, and you're like, okay, right? Like, you're trying to imagine, like, what's square one look like? And sometimes I think it's just good to, like, identify, like, your different points of reference, and the, you know, what are your assumptions about, like, the world? Like, maybe you could start there, and it works. Like, do you think people are mostly good? Like, that's kind of an interesting place to start when you think about how people engage politically. Like, what do they expect? Do they have high or low expectations of a political system? Do you think that people can change in your lifetime? Right? If people are like, oh, nobody changes, like, that's a hard person to talk to, right? So when you're talking about like racial composition, I think it's worth saying that there are a lot of, like, race conscious white people who, when they're talking to other race conscious white people, they're like on high alert with one another, and they're like always ready to police each other. And that sounds really tense, you know, and it doesn't sound like a place of compassion. It sounds like paranoia. And if we can see more white, like mostly white spaces where compassion is like a real center for how people talk about race, even amongst race conscious people, like understand fallibility, like, know you're fallible, and try to do better, and keep working on doing better. And when you're talking, if you're white and you're talking to other white people who aren't particularly race conscious, they're kind of colorblind, like, you know, do your best. But if you don't win them over, you are still an actor, right? Like, so what can white people do? Like, this is the big question. Well, what can white people do? What can I do? Well, if you live in the United States, like, do you understand some of, like, the ways, like, politics work? Do you understand some of the ways that economics work? It matters where you buy your food. It matters, you know, what businesses you support. If you can make an effort every week, twice a month to, you know, patronize a Black-owned business, a woman-owned business, like whatever it is, then commit to it. And then you are doing things. And some people are gonna feel like, I'm not doing enough. Yeah, because you can't carry everything for your racial group, right? You can do your best, you can try to influence, but what we need is like, we need steady action. We need it to be consistent. We need people, you know, so the question that started this session that was on the kind of wallpapery thing, if we bothered our congressional representative every week with something that we wanted, like they'd listen to that stuff. In so much so it's almost kind of bothersome, because you see in May of 2006 with the immigrant, some people call it a day without a Mexican, some people call it immigrant rights marches, some people call it May Day marches, but the marches that occurred up until now, and maybe still now, were the biggest this country had ever seen, period. Right? Ever. And with all those millions of people in the streets, congressional representatives were still looking at the handwritten mail they got from their constituents who said, I'm really worried about immigrants, right? And that, what's disheartening about that is all the people power in the street being, you know, kind of like pushed to the side, while the constituent who took the time to write the letter got a certain amount of attention, right? And when I learned about that, and when Chris Cepeda-Millán wrote this book called Latino Mass Mobilization, when I learned about that, it made me really think about like, wow, when you call a congressional office and where you write a letter, those things get counted, right? That's like how they test the water. So go bother that person, right? Be familiar to them, right? We can write letters to our local paper, which of course are much fewer than they used to be, which was very sad. We can take all kinds of action. We can be vocal with our school boards. Right now, there's a whole lot of support that our public school teachers need to kind of get the best labor practices they can have for this crazy fall that we're about to enter, right? We need people to be loud there. And so you can't do everything, but you can do some things like really well. And if you have a lot of money, you can donate some of that money to a lot of places. And if you don't have a lot of money, but you have some time on hand, use it. If we weren't in quarantine like we are, like I'd be saying, let's all like have our potluck dinner and let's, you know, do some hell raising together. We'll do something together, and you make it fun too. In lieu of doing things in person, we can do our thing like we're doing now, right? But to take action, right? I love seeing people who are donating to get people bailed out of jail, right? With these protests. And then when, like in Richmond, when they had so much money, they bailed everybody out, they sent that to another city. Like that is solidarity. And we can all be part of that. So lots of ways to participate and lots of ways to do our thing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lopez Bunyasi. Thank you for joining us. Andy, I wanted to see if you had an additional question.
No, this was really great. I love the how to approach in this book. Helps people to really, you know, where they find themselves, where they are, and be able to move forward. And I'm always, you mentioned something, I think, about where people come from different, you know, places where they are. Some people come and just want to ask questions, especially to Black people, questions that are like so, I don't know, so last year, I guess. And I think Black people get tired of being asked those questions. And you know, you talk about people that should do their homework first. They should at least read something first before they start asking the questions and poking holes at the answers that they get. So how do you deal with folks that refuse to even begin the conversation because they feel like the end is not going to be good for them? I hear that over and over again, and especially when they're dealing with people of color, people different than they are, to be able to have that kind of conversation with those folks. They immediately start on a different plane, and they're not even listening to one another. So I know your co-author is a Black woman, and I'm sure you were sparring on these issues, obviously, to come up to a better understanding of how to go about introducing this topic to those folks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had a lot of fun conversations about that. And the thing is, we both landed on that you're not going to have everybody join in. And if you encounter a person who's not willing to even be curious, like, I don't have time for the uncurious person right now. Right. It doesn't mean that I don't see them as a human being. It doesn't mean that they won't one day join us. But if you're not even curious, I have other things to do. Okay, so in a world of such wealth of information, you can go find out some stuff, right? And I would encourage you to, as much as possible, read things that have been vetted by somebody other than just the author, right? Like, unless somebody's saying this is my opinion and only my opinion, fine. But if you want to learn about like history or policy and whatever, then like, this is a peer-reviewed book. There are, newspapers where editors are reading over articles. It's not just a thought that came on Twitter. And some great things come out of Twitter, but not everything. And so for the uncurious person, you're not there. You're not ready. You're not even interested, right? You're not interested. So what can I do? I will do nothing, apparently. What I am interested in is energizing and mobilizing as many people who we have ready to work, because I think what this election is going to come down to is mobilization. And of course, we also have to think about any kind of crazy shenanigans with the pandemic and how many polling places are going to be, and if we're doing mail, but it always comes down to mobilization. We need to show up, and we need to show up at midterms, and we need to show up all the small elections. We have to do these things, because if even race conscious and or just people of color, we don't show up, like, we can expect nothing, right? But sometimes people they get into their heads that, it doesn't matter, or it couldn't get any worse. Like, actually, I think this could get a lot worse. I don't even want to go there, but every day there seems to be something that happens that I'm like, right? Like, we're all like, what? How is this happening? It could happen. It could get worse. There are certain Supreme Court cases that haven't been overturned yet that are dehumanizing. There's so much at stake. So Stay Woke isn't for the KKK member, but for the person who's maybe been off kind of like observing, but not sure how to ask questions and not sure. Sometimes having a book is the best conversation a person can have, right? They have their time, they can do it at their pace. And I think that's a beautiful thing about a book. Some people, that's the only friend they have is a book. And I mean that because they don't know who else they can talk to. And so that's one of the reasons why we put discussion questions in the book, so that you can either ask them of yourself, or you can have your small group do it together. And, but we have to keep pressing on. We have multiple tools on our tool belt. It's not just about voting, where we're putting our money, what we're doing, how we can care for one another, children, healthcare. It's everywhere. So we all get to have a say, and we get to have a lot of things to say. So let's just go for it. Don't get weighed down by people who aren't ready. Our energy is precious. Let's use it. especially right now. Can't tell you how exhausted I am, but I am like trying to like energize other people. I'm trying to keep myself energized and be strategic about the things that amplify the voice. Literally, like if it's really worth fighting for, like polling places, we have to do that. We have to have that open. We have to get as many of these swabs in our noses as we possibly can, right? We need to get our masks on, right? We need to take care of each other. So let's just focus on doing that. And then, you know, you encounter somebody you can pass the book on. There's like 50 other books that are also good and you could be reading.
I have mine here. And
Maybe a book to bring to your Thanksgiving dinner this coming Thanksgiving when you go home to see family. Maybe you can hand it out, put it on their next to their placemats at every table or something.
I'm certainly an outlier in certain parts of my family. That's for sure. But other parts are like, hey, Tehama wrote this, so let's give it a try. So I'm like, okay, cool, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say again, thank you so much, Dr. Lopez Bunyasi, and I want to definitely endorse and plug this book. I think it's essential, and you mentioned something that's really dear to my heart. High school is as well, and I know that there's a larger movement in the country to change and transform curriculum in terms of African American studies, and I think I could definitely see this being utilized in the classroom for teachers and educators. And I know we have so many educators who are part of these talks, but I really want to thank all of you for joining us, having this conversation. It's so meaningful, and we thank Dr. Lopez Bunyasi for her expertise and her activism. And we would just like to tell everyone to reach out and continue to support the work of the Mitchell program. And there'll be details in the chat for the ways in which you can support the work of the Mitchell program and our students. And we also want to give a special thanks to the Carter School, as well as Andy Shallal of Busboys and Poets, one of our most faithful supporters.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. This has been such a pleasure.
It's a pleasure to have you. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Good night.
All right. Good night, everyone. Be well.